Hello, and today is our first day of neuroscience. In this class, we're primarily going to be focusing on the brain. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into super deep depth on any of this, but a lot of you are going to be going on to either major in psychology, major in some type of health field, or biology, and you will most likely be able to have another course which is a little bit deeper in depth. But this is really the first part of the biological psychology section. Biological psychology is called several things, including physiological psychology as well as behavioral neuroscience. So that's where we're going to start today. So the first question we have is actually a little bit more of an activity. I normally prefer to start with discussions, but had a lot of trivia. Figured we could start this way to get everybody going. So what do you know about the brain? You guys can think about that for a second, because I'm about to give you several questions which are true or false. And after I read the thing, you can feel free to pause, come up with your idea, and then move on to the next one and restart the audio and see if you're correct or not. So, first one, Einstein's brain was different than our brains, well, our average normal brain. True or false? Actually, the answer is false. Einstein's brain was actually looked like any other brain for the most part. It was a little bit smaller from what I understand, as well as a little bit more dense, but there was no major difference between Einstein's brain and another student's brain. And a lot of scientists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what made him different. And his brain, after he passed away, has been studied quite extensively. Part of it, as of 2021, I do know part of his brain is in Philadelphia. See, I think it's called the Mutter Museum. I've never actually been there, and I've also never heard it pronounced. But it's off in Philadelphia. You can actually look at slides of the guy's brain. Well, the only thing we really do know about it is they've said it's a little bit smaller and a little bit denser. But other than that, not really super remarkable. So who knows how he did what he did. The next one, we only use 10% of our brain. True or false? So the answer is false. We don't use only 10% of the brain. Our brain pretty much shows for the most of the average day, shows an awful lot of activity throughout different parts. Now, I don't know where this 10% of our brain comes from. I like thinking that it was some parent who was dealing with a lazy child, and said, and trying to use this as a reason to, get them to apply themselves. However, I really don't know. But this was a myth that has been around for a long time. And with the various forms of technology that we have that we can study the brain, we can see that realistically, it's not just 10%. Depending on what activity is going on at any particular time, certain parts of the brain light up, fairly drastically. But everything depends on what they're doing. So it's way more than 10%. It's probably closer to 90, depending on what's going on. It all depends. Another one, listening to Mozart makes you smarter. True or false? The answer is false. I'm not quite sure where this idea where listening to Mozart, or really any classical, really comes about. However, this is another common one. People are making a lot of money selling classical music to pregnant women. And the research shows that, if anything, it's a really, really small bump, and it's not permanent. It just goes away after I can't remember if it was 20, 30 minutes. It was very short lasting. Now, in tremendous irony, if you ever spend time on hold for educational testing service, they do the GRE. I spent hours and hours on hold with them on summer, and they're just blasting classical music. And when I came off hold, I kept making jokes about, are they really doing this to prep me to take this test? Because I can take it right now. And everybody laughed at that, because they also knew that the whole Mozart classical music isn't really accurate. Here's one. People are either right-brained or left-brained. True or false? The answer is actually false. I'm not really quite sure where some of this comes from. It probably does come from something regarding what we do know about the brain. Different hemispheres do specialize. However, people are going to be using both sides of their hemispheres, both sides of their brain. Just because you're a very logical person, logic tends to be towards left, doesn't mean that your right brain, the right hemisphere, has completely shut off and detoured. Probably does not do that. A lot of people look at this concept of right or left-brained to describe how you like, what your hobbies are, what you like to do. However, really, all of us are whole-brained. Drinking alcohol always kills brain cells. True or false? So for those of you who've taken stuff like the SAT, they might have given you some advice on words like always or words like never. To basically telling you to always be careful of those, because sometimes that's a key to clue you in that maybe something isn't really accurate, because they try to trick you. Drinking alcohol does not always kill brain cells. It's in fact false. There has been some research, and I believe it was out in France, regarding a glass of red wine a day. And that actually was shown to have a somewhat protective effect, and I believe it was for strokes, which is a problem that occurs in your brain. Now, that doesn't mean that drinking a lot of alcohol can't kill brain cells, because certainly it can. If you drink too much of anything, I'm sure you're going to have some type of damage. But having a glass of wine a day probably isn't going to do too much brain damage. So, brain damage is always permanent. True or false? So the answer to this is that it's false. So I can actually give myself up as an example for this. But many years ago, I'm still a very severe epileptic, but but many years ago, I had so many seizures in a week. I'd have 100 seizures a week, and it got to the point it was affecting parts of my brain. It was showing, I was having issues walking. I was sometimes having issues talking or understanding what was being said to me, even when a seizure was not occurring. And I had lots and lots of problems. We did several tests, which shows I had brain damage. Okay. So some people told my husband, don't be too rough on poor Mel, because Mel might not be the same ever again. And they told the same thing to me. However, the brain actually is much more plastic than we would think. At least that's what we found out the past, a few decades. So I think we were probably given, much older information. But if you spoke to me, whatever it was, a little bit over 10 years ago, say 15 years ago, and say, you're not going to be able to walk that much anymore, you're not going to be able to talk anymore, you're barely going to be able to read. That's what I was told. And then if they had said, that's what we told you, but it's going to turn out that you're going to get up, you're going to go back, get another graduate degree. You're going to be speaking in front of, 40-something students, teaching Introduction to Psychology. And you're going to be standing there, and you're going to be, your walking is going to be mostly together. I wouldn't have believed you. My doctors wouldn't have really believed you either, because they were very convinced that that I was pretty much shot. Now, there is permanent brain damage. You can damage it permanently, but a lot of times where they are showing brain damage, a lot of people in the right situation can actually recover quite a bit of function. So, brain damage is not always permanent. The heart is more important for love than the brain. Is it true or false? It is false. We probably really should be giving chocolate brains at Valentine's Day rather than chocolate hearts, because the brain is much more processing those emotions such as love than the heart is. However, this is a holdback from several centuries or millennia ago, where they believed the heart was basically the much more important than, not that the heart is important, but the heart was much more important in matters like this. They also used to think it was the place that all the thoughts came from, too. That's not entirely accurate either. Well, it's not accurate at all. Everything comes down to the brain. So here's another one. True or false? The human brain is larger than any other animal brain. True or false? The answer is false. There are a lot of animals that are way bigger than us, and some of them do have a much bigger brain. Now, we have a very good brain-to-body ratio, but for actual size of the brain, that's a whole different story. And our brain also is much more folded than a lot of other places. But we do know that there are other animals that have a much larger brain. So here's the last one. The human brain can survive with only one hemisphere. True or false? So the answer to this one is true. The brain can survive with only one hemisphere. Some people have had to have their brains partially removed or just one hemisphere removed. And not only did they survive, they thrived. But let me show you a video about talking about a person who had that situation. So, I have a little video about a young lady who only has half a brain. So I figure I'm going to let her tell you all about it.
I have half a brain. When people meet me, they have no idea. I only remember my very first seizure. I was at my daycare playing, and the next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance.
hightailed it to the hospital and just watched her. She had another seizure the next morning, but nothing that they did worked. She was constantly falling to the left, and it got so bad that one of us had to be on her left side all the time.
It was to the point where I was having seizures every 3 minutes, and that wasn't cool.
The doctor explained that the only way they could treat it was to take out the half of the brain that was affected.
In very, very early childhood, the brain is thought to be in one of its most plastic states. And if you change the brain at that point, there may be a better capacity for the brain to reorganize.
I am a very positive person. A lot of times I'll joke that they took out the mean side of my brain and they only left the happy side.
If you had asked me 25 years ago if it was possible to take out half the brain and still have functioning life, I would have said, you've got to be crazy. But here we are.
Life now with half a brain is, for me, is no different than anybody else. I've been married 4 years. I live on my own with my husband. I'm really glad my parents did what they did, because I wouldn't be where I am now if I had had the surgery any later or had waited any longer.
So that's an interesting story, and she's not the only person that has had half their brain removed. So people like the young girl we just saw were able to survive and still thrive because of our understanding of neuroscience, as well as neurology and all that stuff that relates to the brain. So what is neuroscience? It's basically how the nervous system functions. The nervous system has two main chunks. Well, they'll all be subdivided, but to start, we start with the two main chunks. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral, which is pretty much everything else. If it does not involve those first two things, it is part of that second system. Now, the nervous system has a lot of functions. This is representative, but certainly isn't everything. Anything that involves getting in external stimuli, well, even some internal stimuli, honestly, and acting on it is part of this system. That could be sensations, such as somebody touching you. Could be some type of, audio system, stuff coming in. Vision, of course, that's all part of the nervous system as well. The nervous system also integrates information from all different parts of the body and external side, and actually formulates this picture so we can understand what's going on. Motor, the nervous system is the reason you move. At least how humans move. I'm sure there are other animals. I shouldn't say other animals, but there are other life forms, shall we say, that are able to move without a nervous system, but they are very, very simple organisms. Nervous system also is how we have behavior, and this is everything from fighting, flighting, to more complex behaviors such as social interaction. All that is controlled by the nervous system. It's also responsible for consciousness. Now, the argument over what is consciousness sometimes gets more philosophical as well, but if you ever look at any of the stuff about introduction to psych and what you're supposed to cover. Consciousness, you actually are supposed to cover different stages. Also, this is one of my areas of research, so we are going to be covering that coming up soon. So, of course, joke, what do you call a cow that is a brain researcher? A neuroscientist. Thank you, I'll be here all day. Anyway, so we're going to start with the evolution of the brain. If you go off to study biological psychology, or biological anthropology even, or many forms of healthcare, you're probably going to learn a whole lot more about the brain theory. We call this many things. One of the names is the triunal brain theory, which basically says your brain has 3 sections: lizard, mammal, human. So this is how it basically evolved. The very first brain that we are aware of is, see this stuff on the figure, this red stuff? That is called the lizard brain. Sometimes you might hear it called the reptilian brain. This is the earliest stage of brain development. This has the you got most of the cerebellum here, got the brainstem. All the very primitive areas of the brain are right there. And there's not a whole lot of thinking going on here. Not sure if many of you guys have lizards or snakes as pets, but watch them sometime. Everything that they do is pretty much an automatic response. There's all sorts of things that they can do. Maybe you go down and stick your hand in their cage. They might try to attack you. They might try to run off, unless they're used to you. Maybe they then don't do anything. But most of what this is going to do is activate that fight or flight response. There's, like I said, not a whole lot of upper thinking going on. The next stage, this purplish thing, you can see that here, is what they sometimes call the mammal brain. We're not really sure when exactly this developed, but we do know that the early mammals, because we can tell this by their skulls, figure out what was going on, the early mammals did have this additional chunk of the system, of the brain. The limbic system developing more right here. You're going to start seeing some decisions making. Not a whole lot of decision making, but you're going to start seeing some decisions that are made. This is when animals start having different forms of emotions, probably very basic emotions. They're going to start to remember. Your memory gets a little bit better. And they're going to start to build habits. So these animals, maybe they remember, oh, this person is coming and constantly gives me food. I'm not going to bite them. So they can override a little bit of that fear and fight or flight of the lizard brain. So that's what's going on there. This next type, you see all this blue around here. This is, they call it many things, including the human brain. I'm not a huge fan of that terminology because I think it's very, I guess, speciesist would be the probably the best term. But this is when a whole lot of that neocortex evolves right there. Seeing more rationalization, more reasons for doing things. That's coming in to their decision-making process. But one of the reasons I don't like this term about human brain is look at what it says is in here: language, abstract thought, imagination, and consciousness. The thing is that humans are not the only animal that has language. If you ever look at the dolphin has a very, very complex language. Other primates also have language. Whether we can understand them or not completely, that's a whole other story. But they do have language. They have at least spoken. I mean, you can argue dogs also have spoken language too, but the dolphins are very, very clear. We also know that some of the primates have actually been proven that it looks like they could actually be sentient. They can recognize themselves in a mirror. I know the dolphins can too. They're very good problem solvers, some of them. And sometimes you can see the reasons or rationalizations. So, this term human brain isn't really, I don't think, the best term. But that's what a lot of places do call it, as far as this triunal brain theory goes. Just be aware that it's not just only humans that have that. The brain is super, super complex. I have this slide up, not because I feel like I should be explaining this, because you're going to get a whole lot more of it if you go on to biology. In biology, go off to medical school. You'll spend days, if not weeks, in embryology discussing all parts of this. So I actually have a video that's going to be coming up in just a minute that takes all of this through this. This makes much more sense if you see like an animation. I just cannot draw worth jack diddly. But basically it's showing that we have the line of cells eventually start to fold, become a neural tube. They basically start creating a direction. They start to develop into different parts of the brain, and cephalization, that's basically your head is being created, and more information just continues on and subdivides itself even more. But I've got a video I'm going to show that in just a minute. So, as I mentioned, the brain on the other slide shows it divides into different sections. Here are 4 different sections: forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, spinal cord. And there's also different subsections in here. You'll learn more about that if you take further courses. But I wanted to have you see this, so when I show you this other video, you will understand a little bit more about what they're actually discussing. So, if you saw the previous slides, as I mentioned, I can't draw worth anything. However, there is a really good video from 2 Minute Neuroscience that talks about early neural development in humans. And I figured he might be a much better person to show this than me.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss early neural development. The development of the nervous system begins at around the 3rd week of embryonic development, when an area of the ectoderm, or the outer tissue layer of the embryo, thickens and forms what is known as the neural plate. This plate begins to fold inward, forming a groove called the neural groove. The sides of the neural groove, known as the neural folds, begin to come together. At the end of the 3rd week, the folds will begin to fuse together. By the end of the 4th week, they have completely fused together to form the neural tube, which will eventually become the brain and the spinal cord. As the neural tube closes, bulges and bends begin to appear and they gradually become more noticeable. During the 4th week, there are 3 of these bulges present. They are called the primary vesicles. They are the prosencephalon, which will eventually form the cerebrum, the mesencephalon, which will eventually become the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon, which will eventually become the rest of the brainstem and the cerebellum. The end of the neural tube will form the spinal cord. As the brain continues to develop, 2 of these vesicles further subdivide to form secondary vesicles. The prosencephalon forms the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon will become the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon will eventually consist of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and other structures. The mesencephalon does not subdivide any further and will become the midbrain. The rhombencephalon will subdivide into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. The metencephalon will become the pons and the cerebellum, and the myencephalon will become the medulla. The spinal cord will still form from the end of the neural tube. Next, the neural tube will continue to develop to look more like the brain. The telencephalon will grow more rapidly than other parts of the tube, and by 11 weeks, the brain will have a similar shape as to what it will at birth. Although it will continue to develop after birth, the brain at birth is structurally similar to a fully developed brain.
And now you guys know why I didn't attempt to draw that. Uh, he does a much better job at explaining all that than me, so I figured I would let him do that. What we have here is the structure of the nervous system. I did mention a little bit earlier that it has two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central being the brain, the spinal cord, and peripheral being everything else. But because scientists are scientists, they really like dividing things out. And in just a moment, we're going to see about all the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is divided up into additional sections, which are in turn divided again into even more subsections. So let's go through them. The next section that we have, one of the subsections of the peripheral nervous system, is what's called the somatic nervous system. This is controlled of all those voluntary motions that you're doing. Going off, petting your dog is, you're voluntarily doing that. Choosing to type, eating, all those things. If you're purposely going out and reaching out, that's part of this system. Now these are controlled by several main subsections here, the cranial nerves as well as the spinal nerves. If you go on to medical school or whatnot, you're going to learn how to, at the very least, test all of the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Each one does something a little bit different, and each one you will learn how to test in more detail than you want. That's actually usually in the first year of medical school, first semester really. If you want to look at the spinal nerves, there are about 31 pair of spinal nerves, and they do go up and down your spinal cord. Whether the naming of the spinal nerves relates to what, for the most part, relates to what vertebra they're near. They might be going over the vertebra or under the vertebra, depending on where in the spinal cord it is. But you'll eventually learn more about those if you ever go into dissecting a cadaver and get to their back. You will be able to see these things in very interesting detail, more than you will probably ever want to know. I know because I did that in med school. There's also a section of nerves, instead of the somatic, which you're very voluntary. There's a section called the autonomic nervous system. You're not controlling these. It's pretty much doing this on automatic, hence auto in the name. There are two groups of that, parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Now, I'm going to tell you each what they do, and I will also tell you a little bit of a way of how to help you remember which one is which. The parasympathetic is rest and digest. These people are not under stress. They're very calm. This is what you're doing when you can just hang out and you're not pretty much worrying about anything that's going on. The sympathetic nervous system is what activates when you are under stress. If you are being chased by a lion, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's going to start making your heart beat faster, making you breathe more. And then you go off to do whatever you do, hopefully running away from the lion. Although you could fight the lion, freeze. Sometimes it's hard to imagine what you're going to do in any situation until you're already there. But because the sympathetic does trigger when you're under stress, then here's a way to remember it. Stress starts with an S, so does sympathetic. So SS. If you're under an exam, you're under stress, that's your sympathetic nervous system that's going to activate. Now, all you have to do is remember the other one, which does not start with an S. So that's a way to do it. So provided you can remember that sympathetic starts with an S, and it is triggered by stress, and you remember that the other one is parasympathetic, that should really help you out if you ever have to divide this out and name which does what. So I just gave a little bit of an example, but can we give some ideas of when each of these might be activated? I'll give you a hint. The somatic nervous system, again, is doing things like typing, taking notes. Those of you who are taking notes off this lecture, if assuming you're writing things down, you're voluntarily writing. The sympathetic nervous system is going to activate, say, if I tell you there's going to be a pop quiz. Now you're under stress. Heart's racing, breathing probably increased, you may even start to sweat. Parasympathetic, you're laying in a hammock and just chilling out. Sit there and you don't have a care in the world. So that's when each one of those work. So as far as the basic parts of the brain, like I said, we've got to stay fairly basic. We have the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebral hemispheres. So that's how we divide this out. Brainstem. There are several sections of the brainstem. You mostly hear about the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and all of these are one of the oldest parts of the brain. And they are in control of a lot of very, very basic functions. These are in charge of your survival. They help you know when to breathe. They help control your heart rate. They help control your sleep-wake cycle. They're not in complete control of it, but they do help influence it. Basically the brainstem starts talking to part of the hypothalamus, which actually has more to say. But if the brainstem is damaged and it can't communicate with the hypothalamus, you might have issues with your sleep-wake cycle. You could even die from lack of sleep. That's all of those things. It also does have some motor function, as well as some sensory function, and it has a lot to do, with various forms of hormonal behavior. Not all of them, but certainly the information that it sends to other parts of the brain can trigger various forms of release or non-release. The cerebellum is this big old ridiculous looking thing at the back of your brain. You see it right here. It's pointed out on the photo. It does actually a fair amount of stuff. Is also a fairly old part of your brain. Now, if you're a klutz like I am, we get to blame our cerebellum because that's actually in control of muscle coordination as well as balance. So if you tend to fall a lot, this might be the thing to blame. We also know fairly recently that the cerebellum also has some cognitive function as well as some language function. It is involved in that. They only just recently found that out, but that is something that it also does. Before, we also used to think it was all up in the cerebrum. It's not so much the case. We also know that the cerebellum is very, very dense with neurons. It's one of the densest portions of the human brain. There it is right there. So the third section, and that's usually what we're really thinking about, is the cerebellum, and realistically the cerebral hemisphere. That's usually what we're really thinking about. That's the most noticeable parts, really. And we do have two hemispheres, at least most people have two hemispheres. And it's very easy. One's the left and one's the right. What confuses some people is that each one's controlling the opposite end of the body. So your left hemisphere is doing most of the work on the right side of the body, and the right is controlling most of the stuff on the left side of the body. It's very interesting. This whole concept of left and right brain, not sure where it all comes from, but it probably has something to do with different parts of the brain do things differently. For example, if we put you in a scanner to see what part of your brain is active at any particular time, and we give you a lot of math or logic stuff, that left hemisphere will tend to show more activity. We also will show, if it's something a little bit more creative, the right hemisphere will tend to be more active. The left hemisphere also is very interesting. It is usually the seat of language, but that is only in most people. If you're left-handed, there is a good possibility that it also could be in your right side. But most right-handed people are in the left. Left-handed people apparently can go either way as far as what side it is. You're looking at the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, those things. Those are the two language sections. I do know that Broca at least sometimes does move to the right side of the brain. Now, these two hemispheres are not completely independent. They are connected to each other. And that they're connected by this big bunch of nerves called the corpus callosum. If you ever have the pleasure of looking at a brain and can pop it over and see this huge bundle, you will know what it is, I assure you. And that's what allows these two hemispheres to talk. Now, the problem with this corpus callosum is that, quite frankly, sometimes there are brain disorders which can affect one part of the brain and can spread to a different part. I've already mentioned that I do have epilepsy. Epilepsy is one of those situations where if you have a generalized seizure that happens in one side of your brain, if you're not careful, it might migrate to the other side of the brain. So some people go through a type of surgery to cut that bundle of nerves, actually to help with their epilepsy, and sometimes there's very interesting results, which I'm about to show you. So I do have a video regarding the corpus callosum. Now, this is not very graphic. It's more interesting. This guy has already had the surgery, and we're just showing how the different parts of his brain functions now that they can't talk to each other very clearly. If you guys are, familiar with some of the old TV shows like MASH, you're going to really recognize the host of this particular video. So let's get to it.
We began our journey into the human brain here on the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. I'd come to meet one of the world's leading brain scientists, Mike Gazzaniga, and a man he's worked with for over a decade. A man with two brains. You've been working a long time with Dr. Gazzaniga?
14 or 15 years.
It doesn't seem like that long, does it?
Well,
The collaboration began when Joe had surgery. And you had this procedure to correct an epileptic problem,
yes.
Is that right?
Trying to stop the seizures. I was having seizures like every day or so, or sometimes 2 or 3 a day.
To control Joe's epileptic seizures, a surgeon severed the connection between the two halves of his brain. Cutting the corpus callosum like this prevented the spread of the electric storms that caused his seizures. But it also prevented the left and right halves of his brain from communicating with each other. In the years since the operation, Joe's epilepsy has been under control. He now earns a living at an egg farm, and in his everyday life, he's largely unaffected by the fact that his left and his right brains work independently.
Do you feel any different when you think about something than you did, any differently from the way you felt before the procedure?
It's just got a backup brain, that's all.
That's something everybody could use, right?
I found out how true that was right away when I was asked to draw a different shape with each hand. In a brain like mine, roughly speaking normal, at least all in one piece, the left half of my brain controls the right side of my body, while the right brain controls the left side.
Oh, no.
But because the two halves are connected,
Nothing wrong with that.
getting each hand to work independently isn't easy.
Well, we were saying that the fact that that Alan's hemispheres are connected, and that the motor messages from one are confusing the motor messages in the other.
I was just drawing an upside-down duck. Okay.
But when Joe is given the same task, his two hands operate as if controlled by two separate brains. What's happening is that each half of Joe's brain is given a separate instruction. He's asked to fix his eyes on the cross in the center of the screen. Anything flashed to the right of the cross goes only to his left hemisphere. Things to the left go to his right hemisphere. Because the two don't communicate, each hand does only what its half of the brain sees.
Wow, look at that. It's really like two different people doing the same.
That's right.
Same task.
That's the idea.
Okay, Joe, I want you to keep your hands out in front
In
of
an
you.
experiment that's now a classic in brain research, Mike Gazzaniga over 30 years ago used a similar setup to find out if the two halves of the brain are specialized to do different things.
Ship.
Joe is being flashed a word only to one half of his brain. Words flashed to the right
Storm.
are seen only by his left brain, and Joe can report seeing those words just fine.
Piano.
Good.
But when a word is flashed to his right brain,
Didn't see that.
Okay. Joe, I'm going to ask you
but now watch what happens.
to draw that with your left hand.
They got me lost.
Why don't you try drawing another picture of it over here, if that will help you.
Oh, phone.
Oh, okay.
Durr.
It's almost as though somebody has given him a secret communication.
That's
and
right.
Now he knows that it's a telephone. But up until then, he was blind to it.
Exactly.
When Gazzaniga first did this experiment, it instantly proved that the ability to speak resides almost exclusively in the left hemisphere. Not until he sees what his right brain is drawing is Joe able to name
He
it.
said church, didn't
After looking at the picture.
he? But he had to figure it out about as long as we did. That's really interesting. It's a picture here of somebody communicating almost with another person.
The communication is not occurring inside the head, it's occurring out on the piece of paper.
Yeah.
Blob. Really don't know.
You want to draw a little bit more?
So far, Joe has been seeing only one word.
Cat.
Things get even stranger when he's flashed two words, each to only one half of his brain.
The right hemisphere saw toad. and
And so his left hand draws a toad.
So there's the toad.
Oh, it's a toad.
And this time I was able to guess what was coming.
Will
Now-
they put a little three-legged stool in there later, or what?
Joe's speaking left brain saw a stool. Saying the word lets the hand that's controlled by his right brain in on the secret.
That's great. That's really interesting. And if he had seen that with the corpus callosum intact, he would have drawn a toadstool.
Right.
Not a toad and a stool.
Right, exactly the point. I've been doing this for 35 years. Yeah?
And
It gets me every time.
Yeah, it must. It must.
This time, instead of naming the word, I want you to point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why,
Okay, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
and when asked to explain,
It was music, bell, and it was a few minutes ago. Last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here, banging away.
So the bell's outside here.
So, look, good enough answer to me.
what's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
One of the unique things to the human brain is this need to interpret why two events occurred. What was the antecedent to this? What caused this? And if you can imagine that a species like us that has that little chip in its brain that asks those questions is going to survive rather well, because it's going to figure out more about the nature of the world than a species that doesn't have that.
Okay, Joe, I want you to keep your hand.
But as I was about to discover, the right brain has a very useful survival skill all its own.
What do you think will happen here?
So for you, we're doing a live experiment. Never done it before.
The experiment involves the 16th century Italian painter Arcimboldo, who made faces out of fruit, flowers, meat, even books. From other research, there's reason to believe that the ability to recognize faces is located exclusively in the right hemisphere. So Mike wondered if Arcimboldo's paintings would look different to each of Joe's two brains.
So will his left hemisphere say, I saw a potato, I didn't see a face? And will his right hemisphere say, I saw the face, and not comment on the fact it was made out of a potato?
You're going to see a figure followed by a choice of two words.
If this works, it'll be terrific, but we'll see. So here it is, live.
Okay?
The first painting goes to the right hemisphere. And Joe points to face.
Down.
The next painting goes to his left brain. And this time he points to fruits. Mike seemed pleased.
Are you having a moment?
This is too good.
Again to the right brain, and Joe sees it as a face.
Point it down.
But to the left brain,
Face made out of books.
Point it up.
Put it in books.
Are you happy with what
Fruit.
you're seeing?
It's unbelievable. He's doing it. You see that?
It's good. It's going so fast. It's shifting from left to right so fast. I can't keep up with you. You're used to looking at this.
When you show him a face in the right side, the left hemisphere,
Yeah.
he's focusing in on the elements that made up the face.
Yeah.
When you show him the exact same picture in the left field, going to the right hemisphere, he's focusing on the face and not the elements.
And not the elements. If you came down from another planet and you saw faces and vegetables, you might not think there was much of a difference among them. But the brain seems to be made up in a certain way to say faces are very different from other objects.
That's right.
And one side of the brain specializes in faces. huh?
Exactly right. Exactly right. It is an adaptation that we have to detect upright faces. It's a very important. You can imagine in an evolutionary time that all of a sudden you have the ability to detect quickly an upright face. You want to read the expression on that face. You want to know if it's friend or foe. You want to have a set of questions about that face.
the right brain might be skilled at recognizing faces. But when it comes to what gives the human mind its power, the ability to reason, to invent, to interpret the world around it, Mike Gazaniga's 30 years of research has taught him which hemisphere he wouldn't want to be without.
The old phrase around our lab is, don't leave home without your left hemisphere. That's where the action is.
So I showed that because I do like showing some of the research, that maybe some of y'all would not have otherwise been exposed to. Plus, I think that that's a really interesting little story, just like it's interesting that the one lady didn't have a brain, or didn't have a full part of her brain. This man's brain just, well, it can't talk to itself. So basically, he's got two brains. He could, I suppose, even play Pictionary with himself, because he doesn't know. Very interesting little story. As we've seen and mostly discussed the two hemispheres and what they do in a general basis and what can happen if they, say, can't communicate properly, it's also important to note that each of these hemispheres are divided into different lobes, such as the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe, that blue right in front of you, does a lot of stuff relating to the cognition, thinking, executive functioning, as well as your voluntary movement. The parietal lobe is a lot of your sensation, your temperature, your taste. There is a figure which you may see if you go onto a more in-depth class than this, that shows what's called the homunculus. And it actually looks at the parietal lobe, and it is basically shows which part of each brain would, because there are very specific parts of that do each individual part of your body, and shows how much what the representation is as far as what what different parts of your parietal resources are doing to this, that, or the other. For example, I know an awful lot of resources are dedicated to your hands and your fingers. So when they show the parietal lobe, they'll show that part much bigger, and just show that that's normally your fingers. If so that's for down the road. But just want to let you be aware of that is. You might be able to find it online. You should be able to find it online, actually. If you look at the temporal lobe, you look at where that is. It is right near your ears. This has a lot to deal with as far as your auditory functioning, your language functioning, as well as parts of your memory. If you look at your occipital lobe, that stuff way in that pinkish red, a lot of that is controls vision. That's primarily what it's done for. Now, if there is a situation that one part of your brain is not being used, a lot of these lobes can sometimes take on some of the functions of a different lobe, such as a blind person. I do know a fair amount of blind people. Their occipital lobe is not processing vision. However, some of those cells have been recruited to give them much better hearing or much better sense of touch. So it's an interesting thing to note that this can happen. The brain is actually very plastic. Of course, as we saw earlier, if there is a person who maybe doesn't have their full hemisphere, well, it's entirely possible that if it's removed young enough, that the brain will make up for that difference and say, okay, we're going to split this off to help continue this part of the body, even though the group that's supposed to control that isn't there anymore or it doesn't work. So I have an activity, and I'm going to show. We should have the time. Well, we can't have the time because this is on recording. But look at, and this next activity is going to test you a little bit on the cerebral lobes and basically what they do. So I want you to look at these things and think about which area would be primarily responsible for processing these things. The first one, hearing a question. What do you think? If you answered the temporal lobe, you're correct. That is almost certainly the main thing that's going to be dealt with, because temporal lobe controls an awful lot of the auditory functioning. So with that, we start off pretty easy. What about this next one? Tuning the dial and the volume on a radio. Parietal, frontal, temporal, or occipital. So to start, it's actually occipital. You have to know you're going to be looking at the radio before you reach out and deal with it. You can then make the argument that you're doing some voluntary movement, probably changing the thing, so there might be a little bit of frontal. You're certainly involved with the parietal because you're having to touch the thing, so you know when you're turning it. And you can also make the argument that the temporal lobe obviously is going to be doing something because you're messing with the volume. So it has to know when the volume is good. What about buying refreshments and decorating your house for an upcoming party. Parietal, frontal, temporal, or occipital. If you said frontal, you're primarily correct. It is primarily the frontal lobe because you're having to make the decision of actually going out and doing everything. Now, that isn't to say the other things aren't going to be involved, but you did have to make the decision that you're going to throw the party in the first place. And you're going to have to calculate how much you can spend on it and what looks good where. A few other things are involved, but primarily it's going to be your frontal lobe because it is doing an awful lot of decision making. What about ducking when a water balloon is being thrown at you? That would primarily be the occipital lobe because you had to see it coming and then you're ducking. So it's primarily the occipital lobe, or at least at first. And then parietal lobe probably activates once you get hit by the water. What about the feeling of pain when somebody pinches you? Frontal, parietal, temporal, or occipital? If you said parietal, you're correct. That is in charge of basically doing all of your sensation. So here are some discussion questions you guys can think about. Did anything surprise you about the discussion? Are there anything else that could cause that split brain situation like the corpus callosum? Hint, there are. And, what about thinking about other animals and their intellectual capacities? So you can just think about that for later. So if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to let me know. Drop a comment, send me a message, whatever you need to do. Thank you so much for being with me. See you later.